everybody, it's me, Sean Bischoff. I'm the general manager of Triumph, and you are now enjoying episode 12 of Together. And I want to start this episode off by revealing a secret. I'm a fraud. I'm not really a podcast host. I'm not really a radio personality. I'm just a manager, dude. And I just want to take a second before this episode, instead of doing an ad read for a sponsor, and just say that, every single episode, we are learning. And I'm trying to improve every single episode. I try to have better questions. I try to, be a better host. Really, the only reason this show is good at all is because our producer, Chase, is a wizard on the keys. In the interest of bringing information to you guys, I'm just trying to improve the format every single week. And so with that being said, I do appreciate every single viewer on the last few episodes. I appreciate all of you guys giving us feedback, sending me feedback privately. It's the only way for me to be informed on how to improve the show, how to make the podcast better and more enjoyable. The whole point of Together is to create a platform where I can bring people from around every different corner of the industry and gather perspectives from them that maybe are not often shared, things that I'm interested in, things that I think you guys might be interested in. So I'm going to continue to do that to the best of my ability, but sometimes it's not going to be perfect, just like my hair. And that's the way it is, man. So, don't forget, when you're listening to this podcast, when you're watching the show on YouTube, leave a comment, give us some feedback, let us know how we're doing. If Chase's editing sucks, let him know. If my question sucks, let me know. If you're going to give us a bad review, PayPal me or email me, and I'll PayPal you $5 to leave a good review. And that's how we roll. With that being said, let's get into the show. I don't want to keep my guests waiting. We do have a guest today. So he's a CSGO aficionado. His name is Nohte. He is a writer and staff. Well, I guess you call him a staff writer for HLTV as well as Dust2us. His name is pretty much ubiquitous with the North American Counter-Strike scene, and I'm really happy to have him on to talk about CS. So, Nohte, how are you, brother?
I'm doing well. My pleasure to be on here, honestly.
Sorry for the long intro.
No, it was pretty good, honestly. Some good jokes. I'll need your email to PayPal you for those reviews. So,
wait, you PayPal me for the reviews? That's what I need.
No, I messed that up. I'll send you my email for you to PayPal me for the reviews. There we go.
You're like getting a review from you would be like a super review. You know what I mean? You're like a super member on what was that on Yelp? You're like a super Yelp member for CSGO.
Oh man, you've done your research. He knows my Yelp account.
So, for listeners that maybe aren't too knowledgeable of where you come from, do you mind taking a minute to kind of introduce yourself a little bit and let everyone know where you're coming from?
Yeah, of course. So basically, I do a lot of the coverage admin work for HLTV. So that includes basically adding a lot of the matches and events for North America, usually like keeping track of MDL and the qualifiers that happen. And that's sort of where I started with them. I also simultaneously started at Dust2, which is sort of focused around covering the North American scene for news and for reporting. And from there, about a year and a half ago, I moved up to HLTV as a staff writer as well. So that's basically, I'm sort of like the North American staff writer, the only North American staff writer for HLTV who covers basically most of this region.
Yeah, you seem to be like the region's number one fan. I feel like you always have your thumb on the pulse of North American CS. Is it like is it weird that to write for both Dust2 and HLTV? Like, aren't they kind of competing?
It is a little bit strange at times, for sure. Yeah, it tends to be where if North American news overlaps, then I tend to have to and HLTV is covering it, then I tend to have to cover it for HLTV. But at the same time, there's definitely tiers of news that HLTV doesn't cover that Dust2 does. So there's still a balance. So I try to usually balance it out as I'll cover for HLTV stuff in the morning to like basically late evening or late afternoon for me, and then Dust2 sort of more towards the evening. That way I can sort of balance that out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I guess HLTV being more focused on global competition, I suppose the only North American news that comes up is like big stuff. And I do see like Dust2 tends to be like a lot of MDL, a lot of Premier news, you know what I mean? A lot of advanced news, even roster moves, small things that maybe HLTV doesn't want to cover.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. just wonder if there's ever like a time where your boss at HLTV like slips you five, and says, "Hey, why don't you cover it for us first?"
Well, what tends to happen is that I'll get some news piece that has to go out on HLTV, and I'll write it, and then Joe Cardelli, who's the editor-in-chief for Dust2, and the co-owner will like yell at me at some point, and I'll be like, "You always write for them." And I was like, I mean, sort of has to happen. But yeah.
I guess it's a tough position to be put in, when you're somebody who obviously is just a big fan of North American CS, so you're just trying to cover as much as possible. I always see you in people's streams. I always see you pretty much commenting, in every big discussion on Twitter and the forums, So I suppose when you're just a thoroughbred CS lover, it's like, for you, it's about, spreading your influence and then trying to balance out like what is appropriate. Like if you have two different jobs that kind of are in the same realms, like, I don't know. It's got to be tough, but you're doing a great job, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
I was going to ask you, prior to writing for HLTV and prior to focusing on NACS, did you have any experience in journalism or writing formally or like beforehand? Maybe outside of esports even? I mean, is this what you went to school for or what?
So no, I never went to school for it. I just generally excelled in English in high school, and past there, I have like no academic credentials towards journalism. I basically, the way I got into it is that I always used to write when I was in high school, and then between graduating high school and my first 2 years of university, I used to go on Rap Genius, if you know what that is, like the lyrics website, and I did a lot of the sort of lyric breakdowns for a bunch of different songs that were on there. And at some point I went from just a regular user to an editor to a moderator, and it was sort of just working through, I guess, editing the content of that site, which just made me generally a little bit better in terms of grammar and overall workflow in terms of editing writing. And from there, I sort of found Counter-Strike, and then it just sort of became a sort of evolution between watching games, reading different pieces that were out on different websites. And then at some point I decided that I'm going to give it a try writing those. Back then there used to be basically an event preview for every big event that would happen. So HLTV would put out like a event preview for each event that would sort of break down the storylines of some of the teams. And so I gave that a shot for just other websites, and I reached out to Unicorn at some point, and Ryan Girata, the editor over there, sort of really helped me hone my writing a little bit more. And then from there, Joe reached out to me and asked me to write for Dust2 when the site was launching, and that sort of just took off from there.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. I don't think I've ever met anyone that has brought up rap lyrics or Rap Genius in like an actual conversation. So you might be the first.
It's a little bit strange, right?
I used to have that website bookmarked when I was in high school because I used to be one of those people back when I was a teenager that I would like tweet or I'd be on Facebook or something, and I would put up lyrics to tell you how brooding I was and how thoughtful I was being at the time. So yeah, maybe you were part of that in my life. I don't know. So what's it been like? I don't want to dwell too long on your job, but I personally have a lot of respect for HLTV in general. I think that they are obviously like the premier sort of coverage waypoint for Counter-Strike, and running a Counter-Strike team, I use HLTV for like everything. I'm tracking everything. I'm keeping up with our matches on HLTV. You know what I mean? Like, it's such a great tool and such a great platform. What's it been like for you working for them so far? How long have you been with them? Like 2 years or something?
Roughly 3.5 years, I believe. Okay. I think I started in August of 2017. So yeah, about 3.5 years, I would say. It's been good, man. Honestly, I would say the last year and a half has definitely been the best time for me, just because I've been able to sort of bring more of the North American side into the limelight. There's definitely been like other North American writers who've sort of done news pieces here and there on North America, but actually having like someone dedicated to shining a light on the region is definitely been beneficial, because at least I can reach out to some of the players that I know and some of the coaches, and then sort of get interviews and get them out a little bit more, like MC recently, for example.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely been the part that I most enjoy about it. And obviously traveling to events, but that hasn't happened for a year at this point.
Yeah,
so.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly North American CS has been a topic of conversation for the last year, the last 6 months, especially the last few months. So, what's your take? I'm sure you've probably talked about this a million times, and I overall probably know your take just from like reading, countless comments over the last 6 months or so. But, how do you feel about what's kind of happened to North American CSGO during the pandemic, and particularly in the last, 3 to 6 months? How would you best sum it up as somebody that follows it every day?
I would say that the trajectory it was headed in was sort of predictable over a year ago. I think the pandemic accelerated some of the decline that was sort of visible a year ago, but regardless, even if the pandemic hadn't had an influence, I think we would have still been eventually in a bit of a dire spot. So I think the fact that the pandemic accelerated it and now we're trying to bounce back from it is almost beneficial, in the sense that the reaction to it was a little bit quicker. So for example, with ESL cutting the ESL Pro League slots last year, the impact from that would have taken more time to have been visible, I think, if we had been offline, because a lot of these players just playing MDL online wouldn't really have had their voices heard. Whereas with every match being online, it's sort of even footing, right? And so at least there was visible change that happened. But I think definitely that ESL Pro League getting the slots getting cut, and in general the release of Valorant has really put us in a tight spot in terms of the players that are left in our scene. But fortunately, I think with the recent ESEA changes, we're seeing some of these players who've left the game come back because they either see the opportunity to compete grow a little bit, or they're more willing to give it another chance, which is, I think, really good. Like Jonji would have been a really big loss for our scene. I think he's a really talented player. So it's nice to see some of these players give it a second shot.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that's the best way to put it too. It's like North America was already in a rough spot anyway, being, the second region behind EU. And a lot of our problems were definitely like brought to light because of the pandemic. And, certainly, recently there's been a lot of effort made. And this was actually something I was going to bring up, and you actually gave me like the perfect segue to talk about this, is to talk about the changes to, the Premier to Pro League format, a lot of the changes that ESEA is implementing, particularly with cash cups with larger prize pools. For instance, there's one cash cup this weekend. It's the first sort of big revamped cash cup of the year. There has been this like targeted effort by leaders in every corner of the CS community, it seems, to improve the situation in North American CS because of how bad it got in, it got in the last 3 to 6 months. And I've got to say, it was surprising to me, the kind of feedback that was being shared between ESEA, ESL, team owners, players, journalists like yourself in the CS community. It was actually sort of like, in the last few months, this reception towards NACS has been sort of unprecedented. I've never seen anything like this in another game. It's like normally games just go to die, but like this game, the community loved it so much that we've all kind of come together to find these solutions. So.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of people involved in CS, and when you break it down by region and you reach the sort of levels where people are super involved in terms of like the ESEA admins and the ESL reps, at that point you're reaching people who are generally very passionate about the game. And when you have that sort of desire to improve it and you let those voices be heard, then at least there can be a chance at some change, which is, I think, where we're reaching right now, which is, I agree with you. I think it's really cool that we were able to at least make an effort to try and sustain the region.
Yeah. And definitely like one thing that it was like the number one thing that I think I was surprised by was ESEA and ESL sort of bumping the prize pool. Because during a pandemic, especially, like I didn't expect to see any prize pools increase. You know, I thought that was going to be like the unfortunate sort of stone that we were going to die on. It was like, you know, maybe players want to come back to CS or continue to try to grind in ACS if the prize pool stayed low. And so I was so surprised to that, because that's a huge ask, man. So I was going to ask you, what do you think about particularly the format changes with ESEA, both having cash cups and also sort of the relegation and promotion system from Premier? Do you think that these are good permanent changes that will, you know, help sort of rebuild NACS, or do you think these are more along the lines of like a Band-Aid? I mean, how do you perceive these changes?
I think the changes are really good. My main concern behind them is that it might have been a little bit too late, just in terms of the impact that's already been had with some of the players who left. Like, if you look back at the start of last year, we've lost a lot of really good, talented players. There's obviously like Dapper was doing really well at the start of this year, for example, or start of last year, sorry. But also just like a handful of other players that have left. But the thing with these changes is that my hope is that they provide long-term lasting impact, because with ESEA sort of doing away with Rank S and less of these pug platforms having more of a focus, then ideally these players that are coming up will be able to actually hone their skills a little bit more in a team environment. Because what I've seen happening for the last few years is that these players get noticed through Rank S and through FPL. And what ends up happening is that they have all these habits built up from playing in these individually focused leagues and hubs. And then they get into a team and they don't have any of the base that you need to compete at a professional level. And so they basically learn the game and then they relearn the other aspect of the game entirely, which just, it doubles the amount of work that you have to do, really, in that sense. So I think the advent of these team cups is going to be really beneficial, but the Premier changes, I do worry that it's not quite enough. I think having 2 groups and changing to best of 3s is really good. When I talked to ESL and to ESEA previously, I suggested them reducing the number of teams in the league, because I just don't think that having 20 teams in MDL is competitive in North America. In Europe, you have a lot of teams that practice very hard and they actually tend to be salaried and they have the time to put in. But in North America, it's just, there's not enough funding in the region for there to be 20 competitive teams in MDL. And so I told them that I'd like to see 12 teams where the top 8 make playoffs and the bottom 4 go to relegation. Because just in general, then it'd be easier to craft narratives around these teams who are a little bit more competitive against each other, and there'd actually be some form of I guess, a higher level of competition at that level.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, dude. I feel a bit vindicated that we share that perspective, because when, you know, we were being asked like what we wanted to see from Premier and from sort of this path to pro, you know, a lot of the input that we gave was immediately responded to, and the changes were made. You know, like switching to groups, 1 best of 3 instead of a bunch of best of 1s every week. You know, they're increasing, you know, viewership efforts, I suppose, like you know, trying to make sure every match is scheduled further ahead of time and broadcasted, you know, professionally, trying to like, you know, make the broadcast quality higher. All these things are good changes, but I agree with you. I'm concerned about the longevity of Premier being like 20 teams. And I do agree it would be like probably better to have a smaller, more competitive, you know, Premier. Like I said, 12 teams, you could go as low as you want. You can go 8 or 10. I think right now there's really only like 8 legit top teams that are going to come out of this Premier season, who are going to put in the effort through the whole season and come out on top and be pretty much in their own sort of class. Because you don't want to have sorry, you don't want to have a division that's like not competitive. You don't want half the games to be complete blowouts. It's just not interesting. You're not creating stories. You're not garnering viewership. You're actually turning viewers away because they start to think, well, half this league is a waste of my time to pay attention to. So I agree with that. I'm not sure like whether or not these changes are good long-term necessarily. They are definitely at least a Band-Aid. They at least make the situation better at hand for now, having higher prize pools and a more clear path to Pro League. I do agree with you though, like what you're trying to say about, it's too late maybe, like a lot of players aren't going to come back. Like I said this recently in one of our episodes actually about how like, pretty much everyone from tier 2 CS like went to Valorant to be tier 1 Valorant. And what that leaves is a void, right? So like the real question is if you want CS to succeed, you have to, at North American CS especially, you have to sort of figure out the solution to bringing new people up, helping develop people to bring them up to the next level. And maybe FPL and Rank S doesn't necessarily do that because like you said, you could be an FPL like a pub star, but have really terrible habits and never succeed in a team. Because if you want to succeed in a team, you have to grind with the same team for a long time, have good coaching, good leadership around you. And so it's like, how do we in North America create systems that reinforce playing in structured teams for long periods of time? I guess you need more tournaments to play. You need bigger prize pools to sort of encourage people to play in teams. But what we saw last year was like MDL was pretty much just a bunch of pug teams,
I think it's twofold in that sense, because no matter how much structural change you have, the incentive to actually improve on an individual level also has to come from the players. And I find that it's a little bit harder to find the players that are individually motivated enough to actually put in that effort. So like once you make it past that FPL level and you're playing in a team environment, to actually put in the hours needed. From the feature pieces I've done, like talking to Grim and Junior, they were both very self-motivated players. They were willing to grind and put in that effort. And I find that that's more and more missing among players. Just because DMing and watching a couple of demos will only get you so far. You also need to go into a server. You need to dry run stuff. You need to practice timings. You need to add more to your game. There's so much that goes into competing at a top level in this game that if you're not being one of those people who's going to put in hours upon hours upon hours, then your path to the top will just be very, very long and arduous. But one other point aside from that is that I would say the players who are currently competing, I think that the changes will at least hopefully drive that through. But one of the issues I've previously talked about in another podcast was that North America just lacks in-game leaders at a semi-pro level especially. So a lot of the in-game leaders that we have that actually had experience, or even just players who had a lot of experience, like Nothing, like Sean Garris, a lot of these guys have just left the game entirely, right? Like Steel, they aren't able to pass on that knowledge that they've gained over years to a lot of these players. And without that, we're really missing a crucial component of bringing these players up. So you look at Chaos with Steel, like he helped bring up Zeppa, he helped bring up Leaf. He taught Vanity a lot in terms of expanding his game. He also, Sheikh Zula was coaching them for a little bit. He picked up some stuff from them. So that's why I think, firstly, I think Sheikh Zula deserves a lot of credit just in terms of the impact he's had on the scene. He doesn't get talked about nearly enough for what he's done in terms of the number of people he's helped bring up. But in general, the lack of in-game leaders and lack of people with experience that can pass it on to some of these younger players who have been primarily molded through those FPL and Rank S environments, not having that means that path is just all the more difficult. You look at Denmark, you have like Hundun, you have MSL, you have Snappy, you have a lot of different varied experienced players that can help mold that talent. We really don't have that here.
Yeah, that is a problem in itself. And I had Tacitus on this show sort of publicly. Of course, I talked to him like every day, but we were sort of discussing this as well. There's like this lack of leadership, both from IGL perspective and also from like a head coach perspective in North America. It's like all the best head coaches have either gone to EU in some form or they've gone to Valorant now. And really you've got MC who decided to stick around with this X Chaos, Bad News Bears mix, which is, in my opinion, it's a huge win because he's one of the only coaches remaining in the North American scene that knows what they're doing for sure, that has brought up countless teams and players. And I know he was, and it might even still be on the fence about going to Valorant if given an opportunity. But yeah, there's not a lot of coaches. There's not a lot of IGLs. IGL-wise, you got Sheikh Zula, which I'm very fortunate that we get to work with. And I have a lot of respect for him, and I agree with you and your perspective of him deserving sort of more respect for what he's done. I mean, he is a really strong IGL, North America's finest, in my opinion. Now, especially with Steel moving and even Vanity, you might consider moving. Then you have maybe Ben. You have Ben Leet. I think he has proven himself to be a strong IGL in some form. At the very least, every project he's worked with has been successful. And that's about it. Like, who else do you have in NA? And how do you even solve that problem, man? Like, you need old players and old coaches to stick around to kind of guide the next generation, which is no matter what ESEA does, no matter what ESL does, they don't necessarily have control over that, right?
And from what I know, this is just a timeless issue in North America. So I may be incorrect on this, but from what I recall, when CGS dissolved, a lot of the more experienced North American players just left. Like they straight up quit and never came back to the game. And so that was sort of the first time where North America was left without any experienced players, and we sort of had to rebuild again. And then I would say the second time this happened was when Sean Garris left, because that's a lot of experience to just lose out on entirely. And so now I would say this is the third iteration of us just losing more experienced, tenured players, whether it be to another game like Valorant or just in general losing them entirely. And it's just there's nowhere that's going to come from other than, I guess, at this point, those players either deciding to come back for some reason or us pulling from, I guess, European players that are a little bit more experienced and are interested in coming over to coach a North American team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one way. And also, to be fair, over time, I think IGLs will develop and good coaches will develop just organically from the depths of hell. You know what I mean? Like just from open to intermediate to advanced and everything. There will be people that just naturally, grow from within themselves and become good leaders and sort of pop up, but it's going to take a lot of time. And then that really leads into like the structure of tournaments available. Like you have to have tournaments available for teams to grow and paths forward for teams to continue to advance. Otherwise, teams won't stick together. And that all kind of circles back to like the real problem is like, if you're a pug team and you're able to just play FPL all the time and then just show up on match days and you could still like be a top 4 MDL team or top 4 Premier team now, what's the point of practicing? What's the point of, putting in effort? It's like this sort of, I don't want to call it bad behavior because people can do whatever they want, but this sort of like behavior that doesn't really promote our growth as a scene is rewarded constantly by teams being successful, just being pug teams. You see teams like Rebirth, teams like Rugrats, they don't have any structure, dude. They show up, like they have different rosters every 3 days because people come and go. People play Valorant for 2 months, they come back, and they're still always getting invited to Dream Hacks. They're always qualifying even, by their respects, they're playing well for huge events. And it's like the only way to combat that really is for other teams to step up, I guess. There's really nothing you can do about like, putting structured teams in the driver's seat other than structured teams have to get better, I guess. We need more of them. I don't know.
Yeah. And I would say on top of that, it's just for a lot, I can see the argument from the player's perspective, because with the lack of, I guess, I wouldn't say lack of organizations, but I guess lack of well-funded organizations, or at least decently funded organizations in North America, it makes it a lot harder for these players to invest that sort of time.
Yeah.
And I can understand that, but at the same time, if this is a game you want to go pro in, and it's a game that you're actually extremely passionate about, it's something that you would put everything aside to do. And that drive is something that I feel is missing from some of these players on these pug teams. Because if you look to Europe, some of these players aren't salaried, and they put in that effort, and then they get those offers. You can't expect to not build up those skills and then get an offer and then build up those skills. You need to actually demonstrate the ability to be marketable, the ability to actually have media appearances, the ability to put in the time individually to get better at the game as well. And you can't expect an organization to look at you and offer you, and based on a promise to do those in the future. And I find that in general is just, it's a very lopsided expectation from players. I can understand that it's hard to work full time and then play CS on top of it. I can respect that, but at the same time, it's just the amount of effort needed to go pro in this game is something that has to be self-driven.
Yeah, no, I suppose you're right. And to be fair, there are still tons of players that are putting in the effort, but there's certainly like a pug lifestyle going on in NACS that is being rewarded consistently, or at least has been very successful. And I suppose it's reinforced by a lot of different stuff, large organizations leaving North American CS, either to go play in Europe or leaving entirely. It's like, there's not really a lot of lights at the end of the tunnel for players that want to get on big teams, because there's only a couple. You got like EG and Liquid maybe. Who else are you going to join? It's like, so that sort of reinforces the pug lifestyle. And then you've got the fact that pug teams are continuously still being at the top of the scene. Like, they are legitimately good enough to be at the top of the scene. So that reinforces the lifestyle. It's like, well, if I can be in the top team and not really try that hard, why would I try hard? And then there's like, there's a lot of stuff going on. For example, this is another great example that a lot of people like to tiptoe around, but the lack of punishment for, betting or for match throwing. It's like, we know there are people in North American MDL, and I'm not going to name them, of course, not my business to do so, but there's quite a few people that were match fixing for multiple seasons, and there's been no consequence for that. ESIC hasn't sent out bans for any of these guys at all yet. And so it's like, when all these things are coming together, it's all this behavior, this pug life behavior sort of reinforced, because you might as well, there's no reason to put in the extra work with the team and, put 12, 14 hours a day when you can just kind of just chill and make it to the top and make all the money. It's like, so what are you supposed to do about it? It's impossible to fix. It's like, all you can do is try, I guess, hope for teams to come back. And certainly, I guess ESEA is doing their part in trying to improve the prize pools and the structure of the tournaments to make it more enjoyable and better for teams to play in, I guess. But
I'm glad you brought it up, because I think I feel like people tend to dodge the whole match fixing betting sort of scenario that's happened, because if you look at it from a player's point of view, if you have these teams that are match fixing or betting on matches, and they're not actually, and they're still competing in like a top 8 MDL sort of position, then you look at that and you think, well, why would I put in 12 hours to practice when these people are coasting and they're just making money? Whereas why would I play 12, 14 hours to get salaried for, I don't know, $1,000 when these guys are making like a couple of $1,000 based on just betting on matches? But the issue with that comes with the fact that it's just completely unethical. And M&M's and I were, a lot of credit to M&M's here, but he's done, I would say, the most of the legwork in terms of this. But we were both researching and looking into these allegations for over a year. And the fact that there was a number of players that knew about the teams that were involved in this and knew about the players that were involved in this, and they just didn't come forth early enough, and they didn't, like, It surprises me that it's well known, but nobody is recording any of these conversations that are happening. Nobody is actually trying to get, like, they have people talking about it, but no one's recording to get evidence of this and sending it to the right authorities. And without that, nothing will actually change. I will say ESEA have been investigating this for quite a while, and I'm hopeful that the investigation results will come forward soon. They just released the whole Australian one where there was 35 players banned. And honestly, I expect like similar numbers for North America, if not more, because I know I've had players come up and tell me like, oh, hey, like I've bet on matches. That's okay though, right? Like it wasn't my own matches. And I don't know what to say because it's very obvious based on Valve's post from 2015 that you just shouldn't be betting on matches at all if you have any aspiration to go pro, especially if you're playing in semi-pro leagues. It just doesn't make any sense that the risk worth the reward versus the reward if you intend to go pro is just not worth it.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's mixed signals in regard to that because specifically to like, well, I think match fixing is a little bit more obvious, but even just to betting on matches, it's like there's mixed signals because there's no punishments being handed out for people that do it. I mean, you did say that literally just, well, we're recording this on the weekend, so literally just within the last day or so, the Australian players were being banned, but even that was a freaking forest fire because half the people that got banned were like had like receipts that they didn't do anything, and like I don't know, who knows how many people were unwrongfully banned or whatever. So there generally in North America, there's been no accountability for this, and stuff that you and I both know that happened. There's stuff that everybody in the NACS knows exactly what happened, probably to the date on some games of like when they were being bet on, when they were being thrown, and there's no accountability for these guys that did it. So, and then at the same time for betting, you have betting websites on every CS webpage. It's like, I don't know, it's like mixed signals. It's like, who knows? Like, can I bet? Like, if I can't bet on games, then how come, I get ads on like even HLTV, for example, has ads for like betting websites. It's like, it's sort of like this ambiguous, state that NACS is in where I don't think a lot of players even know whether or not they're allowed to bet legitimately, some players.
See, there's two sides to that argument though, because I can understand that point of view, but also like betting inherently is not a bad thing. Betting in general brings more people to view games. It incentivizes, it gives people some sort of stake, just casual viewers, that is, gives them some sort of stake into some of these matches. And there's a reason why a lot of the companies in the organizations in Europe have some form of a betting sponsorship, because they do generate revenue and they also do help a lot of these organizations sponsor teams and players. But when you look at a sport, for example, and you have somebody competing at a college level in basketball or in hockey, they're not going to, those matches are still offered on betting web pages, on bookmakers, but these players know that they shouldn't be going and betting on it. Like, just ethically, it is not something that you should be doing. And in general, that is something that should be knowledge that is just acquired by you. It shouldn't be something that has to be necessarily stated outright, but to say that, it has been stated outright by Valve. If it's not specifically in a rule book by ESEA, it doesn't mean that it's all good and that you're in the clear, when Valve has very clearly stated 5 years ago that you should not be betting at all if you're at all interested. Like, that line was very clear in my eyes. And for me as a journalist, like when I first got into watching CSGO, I was betting on matches way before I was writing about anything. And the second I started getting like any form of insider knowledge, I stopped entirely, because it's just not something that it's just not ethical. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And that is just something that should automatically click in someone's head, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah. I mean, I know players that have been on, they have come and gone from CS. Like I know players that have said like, yeah, like I bet on other people's matches, but I never bet on my own. And I tend to believe them. And then you got some players that, just like, oh, I didn't know betting was wrong at all. And then you have some players, obviously the majority of players betting on matches like in Premier, they're obviously up to no good. They know what they're doing. They're using insider info. They know it's not like a good thing to do. They know it's kind of against the rules, but they think, oh, if I use my mom's email or something, I will never get found out. So it's not a big deal. There's obviously like there's a whole array of different people, betting in CS, but it all comes down to, I think, as soon as, the people in charge of handing out fines for betting, handing out fines for match fixing, for throwing, as soon as fines start going out, I think this behavior will stop. Like, you have to reinforce the rules. You have to reinforce, what's good and what's not. And so far we've struggled to do that, unfortunately. And it is, just to go back to what we were talking about, it is like one of the reasons why NACS is in a tough spot. It's not a huge reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons. It's just like half of MDL is just kind of pugging around, maybe betting on matches, maybe not. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't.
Which sort of goes back to the whole idea of reducing the number of teams in the league, because once you have a more competitive scope and these players have something that's a little bit more, like there's more incentive to actually try and play in these matches, then you're reducing the incentive to match fix as well automatically.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's one of the things. I really do think there should be less teams and in Premier, but we'll see how this next season goes, the next couple seasons, and we'll see maybe if we think differently about it. I know ESEA feels really strongly about having 20 teams. Like last season, the last couple seasons there was 18 teams, right? So we've expanded actually from there to have 20 teams. I think that was not necessarily expected. I think that was sort of a consequence of like, Triumph and Chaos coming down from like Pro League, but who knows? I don't know. We'll see. I guess the other big thing that you sort of started to talk on that I did want to bring up in this podcast, man, is the sort of purge of North American organizations from CS. Most specifically, there was something that came up the last few weeks that I figured this would be a really good time to talk about, because I think you and I both have pretty strong opinions. I wanted to bring up Envy. And actually there was some Envy sort of rumors coming out just today, just before recording this. So maybe this is a good time to kind of like think about that a little bit. But a couple weeks ago, Envy pulled out of NACS, out of CS entirely. They dropped their whole team, right? They announced there's sort of a bit of drama going on where Hastra was on Twitter, having some sort of exchange with another journalist, DK, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. Having an exchange about, Envy's role in CS, and he was more or less harping on the cost of being in CS and how it's not really worth it. And I think it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And then a few days later, they pulled out of CS entirely. So I was wondering, this is sort of a trend that we see a lot of huge organizations, Envy, 100 Thieves, even Chaos, I guess you could say, pull out of CS at a time when they needed them most. Kind of like the Airbender. So I was curious of what your opinion is on that, and specifically Envy, but in general, just NA organizations pulling out and what it does to the scene.
I like the Airbender analogy. That's quite good, actually. I find some of the arguments I've seen from these organizations is really disingenuous, primarily because a lot of these North American organizations came in and they hyperinflated salaries 3 years ago, 4 years ago. They came in and they bought teams way above market value, and they paid players way above market value. There's a podcast that I did with Davey and Pernogo and Vu, if anyone's interested in looking that up, where Davey basically talks about how Splice was paying them, I think something like $2 or $3 grand a month, and then Immortals came in and offered them something like $8 grand a month per player at a time where these players were not competing at a top world level at all, like not even close to it. And the fact that these organizations came in and they hyperinflated salaries, and then they try and say that, oh, the investment in CS is not worth it because it's so expensive to have a CS team, is extremely disingenuous in my eyes, because you're part of the issue in the fact that the salaries are that high. And don't get me wrong, if you're competing at a tier 1 top 20 team level, then sure, you deserve to have like a well-paying salary. But when you look at some of the teams that were getting paid those salaries, it just wasn't equal to what they were putting out. And a team like Envy paying some of their players 18 grand a month, reportedly 18 grand a month, is absolutely baffling, because you have players from Chaos that were teamless that would have given you far more value for your brand, that are just left to die because you have nobody actually managing your Counter-Strike division that's dedicated to managing Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike is a very specific industry, and you can't just have somebody from outside of it that just doesn't even consider it, that doesn't consider the specifics of it and consider the dynamics behind some of the teams and players. You need someone involved in it that actually can build you a roster and call the shots. So again, having some of these organizations like Hastro come out and say what he did in terms of the lack of investment in Counter-Strike, their team did very little to promote, or their organization did very little to promote their team. They played in a total of 7 events in 2020, including 3 online open qualifiers, a total of 74 maps for Envy that year. Compare that to Triumph, I think they played something like 193. I looked this up the other day as well. So when you have that sort of disparity and you're not actually trying to market your team, I'm not sure what you really expect in that sense, because I went through social media for Envy as well, and their last tweet about their Counter-Strike team before this whole situation where they released them was like November 2020 or something. So it's not like they're trying to promote them. They're not giving them a platform. Even in this recent video that was released by Hastro or by Predator as one of their sponsors or something, there's zero mention of any of their North American rosters in that team when Hastro is talking about, I guess, building up what it takes to build up a counter or a team or an organization. They focused a lot on their French roster that won a major, but they focused on nothing that's happened since then. And there's actually zero mention of any of the North American rosters that they've hosted. And to me, that just shows like you're not even trying to show some of the hardships behind it, and you're not trying to show that yes, you can also fail if you don't manage it right. And that is what happened, for Envy at least.
Yeah, the Envy situation baffles me a little bit, mostly because so my tweet, I tweeted about, and I can't remember offhand what I said, but it was basically when he was part of that thread saying, oh, being in CS isn't worth it. It's just like burning money, which personally, the reason I got upset at the time is because I felt like it was very disrespectful, not only to his own team, which was still on salary, but just to, our region and our community in general. To hear that from, an industry leader, a true industry leader, like somebody that I have tons of respect for in Hastro, somebody I've done business with multiple times, like I was baffled by it. I just couldn't understand, because it's not an excuse to do poorly. Like I can understand, oh, look, we're spending $100,000 a month on our team and we're getting no results. Like I can understand like where that perspective can be like, well, CS is just in a bad position and it's not worth being in. But like to counter his point, like our team had, a portion of the salary that they have available, a portion of the resources they have. We don't have a facility in Dallas. We don't have private jets to fly to Europe. Like we don't have any of these resources. We're paying a fraction of the salary, and we still managed to have a top 30 year, even while losing players to teams like Liquid, teams like Furia. And so what blows my mind as a general manager of an esports organization is that if you're spending $10,000 to $20,000 a month per player salary and you're doing bad, that's your fault, dude. Like something's going wrong. Like you've picked the wrong people, you're mismanaging something, and it's okay for that to happen every once in a while. It's like no machine's going to run perfectly all the time, but like there's no excuse to say, oh, it's because of the state of NACS. It's like even in the state of NACS, you had teams like Chaos and Triumph having really good years with a portion of the resources you have. So it just felt a little bit disrespectful to me. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think the bigger problem is that this bubble has burst. I think COVID in general has kind of burst the bubble on esports a little bit, because salary inflation was certainly a problem, and it's certainly a problem in in CS in general. So these salaries that players are getting are huge now, man. And it's really hard for smaller organizations to keep up. It's part of the reason that it's hard for organizations like ours or Chaos to stay competitive in a game like CS. It's because you cannot compete with these top teams. Like, I can't hold on to players like Grim or players like Junior when they're being offered 5 times the amount of money on an international space station. You know what I mean? It's like, how can I keep up? But it's because teams like Envy, you know, teams that came in, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, they really like inflated salaries to a huge level. And it was kind of exposed this year because of the financial crisis, right? So I wonder, like, I feel pretty strongly that I think for North American CS particularly to go back to normal, that you need to see a return from large North American organizations. You need to see people like Cloud9, Complexity, EG, Furia. You need to see these guys at least move back to North America so they can practice in our region, live in our region, operate out of our region. I don't know if we can come back without them. I don't know what you think about that.
I unfortunately just don't see that happening in terms of A, the rosters they have right now, but B, just the way that competition has moved to Europe, especially this year, where a lot of the tournaments seem to be based in Europe, and there's more of a focus there. But the thing is that there's a lot of organizations outside of the ones that you mentioned that could house a CS team, but they just don't approach it right. Like, you look at TSM, each new team that's come up in the last, I would say, year and a half, there's always been some rumor where, oh, TSM is part of the talks in getting this team. Like, there was the Wardell one a while ago that ended up, I think Vanity and Wardell were planning on pairing up or something, and then it turned into Vanity going to Chaos. But TSM's been part of these discussions in a bunch of different teams, but they just have nobody, it seems, that actually understands the type of players that you want to put together. And when you don't have that, you're not going to be able to get these rosters right. Like, if you go back a year ago and you gave me the sort of salaries that Envy is offering, or even half of that, like, if you told me that I could build a team and pay players 5 to 10 grand a month, I could build you a top 20 team in North America. But none of the people who are involved in these decisions actually understand the CS scene, especially in North America. And you just can't throw around money and expect it to build you a top 20 team by itself. And on your topic, I think there's a lot of organizations that are still around. Like, there's TSM, there's Space Station, there's FPX, who are now getting, I guess, the X Godsent lineup. But there's also, in general, there's Guild Esports who's coming in. There's a bunch of organizations that are in Valorant that could house a CS team, but they don't, for one reason or the other.
Yeah, I suppose it just leaves a vacuum for other organizations to step up. It's just, I guess, like, you know, having these industry leaders like Liquid and stuff, you know, over in EU, it just takes away from a lot of things in NA, like. And even just from a practice perspective, like, I could tell you, it's hard right now for our teams to get practice. Like, for us, Extra Salt, High Coast, like, it's really tough to come by good practice because we are the best teams in the region now. Like, who are we going to scrim? Like, we're not going to get better by scrimming EG or by scrimming Liquid or by scrimming Cloud9. So I think, like, you have to have these organizations come back, man. I think some of them will, but I guess most of them won't, at least not for a while, because of all the competitions being in EU for probably the majority of this year. I wonder, though, so with Envy, man, I was being really critical of Envy, you know, and I still kind of am about the way that they handle their CS team. I think everybody in the NA CS community knows that whole team was, more for one reason or another, man, it was a dumpster fire for the last 2 years, you know, and it's no excuse from them. I mean, they should be better, considering how good they are with their other teams and how long they've been doing this. But I'm curious if maybe now with one of the rumors that came out about maybe that Brazilian lineup may be going to Envy. This is a very fresh rumor this weekend, but I'm curious if that had an impact. Maybe they wanted to do this all along, because I had heard rumors or read rumors about that project, like Cogyu, ex-MIBR guys, like building a project. I heard like multiple organizations they were supposed to be joining, and only today did somebody leak that it could be Envy. So what do you think about that?
I think it's hard to I guess have a long-term prediction as to how this roster is going to be. The core of that has obviously reached a major in the past, but something to keep in mind is that the game has changed fundamentally since then. One thing I do, the way I see it working out is if Envy are getting this team and they give Kagu control of the roster in terms of him being able to make the decisions as to who to bench, when to bring on a new player, and basically allow him creative control behind that, then I can see the project working out, because again, it relates to having somebody who actually has a beat on the scene to make those decisions. So I think the roster could do well. They did a pretty decent job in Flashpoint 2. I think it's really hard to judge without seeing them compete against some of the top teams and compete at that sort of level for a sustained period. Because when it comes to competing against these top 20 teams, something to keep in mind is that they've played against each other for a really long time, a lot of these players. So a lot of the micro tendencies that these players have, there's CS the game, then there's a meta game inside that, and then when you reach the top 20 level, there's another meta game entirely where these players are anti-stratting each other, and they're very specifically targeting certain tendencies. And when you play for a sustained period of time, you're going to get countered for some of these. So I think it's really hard to make a judgment call on how that'll play out long-term for the roster without seeing them compete against the likes of Astralis or Vitality or Big. I think for Envy, the organization, it's a pretty good move in terms of just trying to get some of that, get their PR a little bit, I guess, improve their PR in general, because the Brazilian fans are generally very passionate, and they're going to be very happy to see like this roster core find a home. And I think for Envy, it'll be a sort of redemption arc in that sense, where they can maybe build their brand back up a little bit in Counter-Strike with this core fan base. So for them, I think it's a good move in at least trying to improve that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you for the most part with that. Like, definitely, like, we know as well as anyone does that the Brazilian fan base is huge and hugely influential, like, for organizations, like building, socials, especially building impressions, building even sales, like merchandising sales, like, and it's kind of meta right now, I guess. So the last like couple months to sort of sign like a Brazilian team or Brazilian player, it's kind of become like the thing, and it's cool because the Brazilian community is getting a lot to celebrate, and Brazilian teams and players are getting a lot of respect now. Again, I think that for a while in international competition, I suppose with the rise of Astralis, it was like Brazilian CS kind of fell to the wayside, and I think Brazilian CS is making a huge comeback, which is good. And certainly for Envy, it's probably a huge factor for them is to like become popular again. And the easiest way to do that is to pick up a very popular Brazilian core. So certainly it's a good move by them. And I imagine that if it is true, of course, this is a very early rumor at this point. Like, if it is true, there's no way that they mess it up, right? There's no
famous last words.
I mean, look, the Envy knows what they're doing to some extent. Who knows why the team fell apart the last team, the last iteration of their CS team. I don't know, but certainly they'll put Cogyu sort of in more control of the roster. Certainly they'll make changes so that this time around things are done properly. And I think it would be a successful project in general. Whether or not they'd be competitive is hard to say, probably. But again, like you said, there's like the super meta top 20 matchup. You don't know who they're going to match up well against, but and it's very interesting. I have one rapid fire question before we end the show, just because we have kind of gone on. That hour flew by really quickly, by the way. Another thing that came out in the last 24 hours anyway, before recording, was the Vitality being fined $10,000 for quote unquote stream sniping. I think we all seen the footage. So I want to get your quick opinion on that. Do you think that that's a fair fine, or do you think it's odd, or what?
I think it's a very precarious situation. ESEA took the stance that it's going to be a very harsh penalty for teams that are caught stream sniping or caught with the stream on in the background in their last post. And basically the whole scenario around that was that they were going to be harsh in the future because they were allowing everything that had happened in the past to basically they were letting go of the past stream sniping situations because they just didn't have enough evidence, and there was apparently a lot of teams that were doing it. So for them, I think it puts them in a really tight spot because now they have all the video evidence in terms of the individual player cameras and the TeamSpeak recordings. And based on their report, they found that the players were not involved in any of the stream sniping. So I think it would be overly harsh to do something like disqualify the team. I'm a firm believer that the consequences should match the impact of the decision. And I think calling for their disqualification when the players weren't necessarily involved in the stream being on would be pretty harsh. I think a $10,000 fine is not enough, though. I don't think it is. For an organization like Vitality, and for this to have been a final warning from ESEA, I don't think that a $10,000 fine is impactful enough to discourage these teams. Like that to me just seems like more of a slap on the wrist than we gave you a final warning sort of scenario.
Yeah, you might be right. I'm not sure how I feel about it yet. I think my opinion on stream sniping, or what it can be conceived as stream sniping, is a little bit, more open-minded than most people I've talked to about this, because I feel like, to be honest, most teams at some point their coach pulls up the stream. And so the concept of stream sniping, and we're talking about middle of a game, the concept of stream sniping is really the idea that you're going to pull up the stream, you're going to maybe take a tech pause and pull up the stream to kind of gather information, share with your team, information they shouldn't know. And that obviously is morally really bad. It's really bad for competition. That should be fine for sure. But I also think there are a lot of people that are pulling up the stream just to check random shit, just to see after a big play how the chat reacts, or just to see what does it look like. And some teams, especially smaller teams, maybe not Vitality and these other teams, but smaller teams are just excited to be on stream. So they'll pull up the stream for sure in the back of the office or whatever. And it's just one of those things that, because there's so many levels of what does it mean to even have a stream on in the background, you have to have a zero tolerance policy, because it's the only way to really govern it, unfortunately. And I don't know if $10,000 is enough to discourage it. I think it would still happen anyway. I bet in Vitality's locker room, it's still going to happen. Occasionally, you're going to have the stream pulled up, whether it's for nefarious purposes or not. But I think 10,000 is a lot. It's kind of I kind of equate that to, I don't know if you're a fan of MMA or the UFC or something, but
I don't watch it too much personally. No.
Okay. It's just one of those fines. It's it's something that's really not necessarily that nefarious, but they have to have a zero tolerance policy. It's if you miss weight, if you're an MMA fighter or a boxer as well, what they do is they fine you 10% of your purse or 20% of your purse. So whatever your total prize pool is going to be, you're going to lose a cut of that, because they know well, it's probably not intentional that you missed weight. It's probably not even that big of a factor in the result of the game, but we have to have a zero tolerance on it. So we're going to take a small bit of your purse. I think 10,000 is quite a bit of money out of blasts.
I don't think it's enough, though, because if you consider the individual players on that team and Vitality being such a massive organization, these players are probably making some of them are probably making 20 to 40 grand a month.
Well, I'm sure I was making $1 million a month.
Yeah, I'm sure I was making an absolute ridiculous amount of money. But when you consider that, you're finding this organization a fraction of one of their players' monthly salaries. That's how I see it. And if ESEA's going to adopt a zero tolerance stance, that just isn't enough.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. We'll see if it keeps happening, Maybe if they do it again, maybe we know that 10,000 wasn't enough. And also, I don't know what ESEA's rule would be if for like a multiple offense situation. But yeah, I don't know. I was just curious about your opinion because I was just reading about it this morning and thinking about it. It's tough to govern. It's like a really tough thing to punish or to fine. So, well, anyway, man, look, Note, I really appreciate you to making time today to come on the show. It was really nice to meet you and actually talk to you about CS. I think that, once again, I'll say it because I don't know the next time I'll talk to you, but I have a lot of respect for what you do in the North American CS community. And I appreciate it. I'm always easy to get in touch with if you want to talk to me or whatever. And, I want us all to work together to make NACS better. So I really appreciate your perspectives today, man.